Chapter 3 starts introducing us to the idea of organization, structure, and organizational culture. These are two very important aspects of project management in terms of how are we going to organize our project and what type of culture do we have that will allow that organizational infrastructure to make us successful in the managing of projects. Most of you are familiar with the functional organizational structure. This is an example of very typical for a manufacturing concern where you have essentially these individual silos of marketing, engineering, manufacturing, and procurement, all reporting as direct reports up through the president. Typically some of the oversight functions such as human resources and finance are also in their own little entity. Since the main ongoing concern of this company is manufacturing, you can kind of see that the functional organizations all are organized under that type of a structure. I think it's pretty obvious from a functional organizational standpoint what the advantages and disadvantages are. They're listed here, and you can see that if you're going to run a project, we just run the project within the organization that the project makes the most sense to be in. If it's an engineering project, engineering runs it within its structure. If it's a marketing project, marketing runs it within its structure. And it makes a lot of sense in most cases. You don't have to make any structural changes, allows for lots of flexibility. You have the expertise where you need it. And afterwards, individuals can go back to do the regular jobs that have been assigned the project. If you have a project that requires cross-functional or across the organizational functions, you will have some problems there because you won't be able to integrate those people in. You won't be able to get them to do work when they need to do work because of all their combating duties within their normal functional structure. And so the project can lose some focus for those that are not in the direct report line to those running the project. And ultimately, if it's a project that's across the organization, you get into an issue of who really owns the project. And so lack of ownership becomes a disadvantage as well. On the extreme example from functional organization becomes organizations that organize themselves around dedicated project teams. You pull everyone that you need out of the various functions, marketing, engineering, procurement, production, and you pull them as a full-time separate unit under the leadership of a full-time project manager. And ultimately, organizations that are organized around projects, it's the human resources and other departments that act as support for the individual projects. Here's an example of a functional infrastructure that has a dedicated project team. Again, if the project has a certain level of strategic importance, has high visibility, is the project that's going to be all and end all for the organization, it's probably smart to set up a dedicated project team, like the way this structure shows it here. Again, with the dedicated project teams, the advantages I think are clear. Again, you've got a team that's in place, so you can get the project going, so it allows for the project to run at a higher pace. You get a group together that stays together. Once you solve all the group dynamic issues, you have a cohesive group working together. It involves those individuals that need to be there, marketing folks, engineering folks, manufacturing folks, whoever, to get the project done. I think you can also see the disadvantages listed here as being a bit of a barrier to doing this. It's expensive. Those people that you put on the project team were doing other work. So someone's got to do that work, or you got to hire temporary workforce to replace the functional work that those people that are now doing project work can't do. You can have a bit of an internal strife, especially if it's a high visibility project, getting lots of resources, and then resource for the day in and day out activities are suffering, so you can see that it can cause some problems. Ultimately, you're limited to who you can put on the team, so you may have some technological expertise limitations. And then the big issue is, what do you do with all these people when the project's over? If it's been a long project, life has gone on for their regular functions, and that work's being done now by someone else. So what happens to those people is always a big concern if you're going to set up a dedicated project team. I previously mentioned under dedicated project teams the extreme of that, and that's organizations that are literally organized around projects, projectized organizations. A lot of construction companies are organized around projects, and you're seeing this more and more, though. You're seeing organizations organize themselves around projects, and you can see you've got a manager for each project. Within each project, you've got the across-the-board expertise that you need out of engineering, manufacturing, procurement, or maybe even subcontractors in some cases. And beyond that, those functions that sit above the project that support the project work, marketing, finance, legal, human resources, those all sit above that report to line. So the project managers and all the functional managers of the support groups all report to the president under this type of structure. The reality is you won't find many times where you'll be able to have dedicated project teams or be organized completely around projects, and so most organizations wind up with some sort of a hybrid structure, matrix structure if you will, where you overlay the project teams over the normal functional structure. It does create some interesting management opportunities. In many cases, you wind up with individuals with two chains of command, the functional command, if you will, and then your project manager. So in effect, anyone working on projects that also have functional responsibilities get to report to two managers. That can become very interesting and maybe challenging in some cases. But what it allows you to do is use your resources in an optimal manner. People can work on multiple projects, and you can get the expertise where you need it. I think we'll talk about advantages and disadvantages in a second, and you'll be able to maybe even start thinking about those as we show what that structure looks like. So here you can see that we've got a matrix organizational structure. You have your typical silos, engineering, manufacturing, marketing. We've got a new direct report up through the president, the director of projects, who then has project managers that would report to the director of projects and have a, if you will, a horizontal report to structure among all the project's participants in the various individual functional units. So you basically have a top to bottom reporting structure and a left to right reporting structure. You can see that there can be different forms of the matrix organizational structure. The weak form, where the authority is mostly in the control of the functional manager, and the project manager only has indirect authority over the staffing. In a balanced form, project manager and functional manager plan out, work together, and balance the responsibilities, and determines how work's going to get done within the project while work needs to get done within the functional organization. And in the strong form, the project manager has that bigger sense of control, and the functional department managers act more like subcontractors or service providers for the project. It's almost, in strong forms, almost start looking like projectized organizations. So looking at the advantages and the disadvantages of matrix form, whether it's weak, balanced, or strong, I think these all come into play to one level or another. On the advantages side, the one that comes to mind that is probably the biggest reason why organizations choose this type of organizational structure is that post-project transition issue. We can get people off the project teams and back into their functional roles way easier under an organizational structure that keeps individuals in those roles. But what that clearly causes on the disadvantage side is the dysfunctional conflict between project manager and functional manager, the stress the individuals feel when they're being pulled in multiple directions, and ultimately gets into some issues on multitasking and inefficient use of resources. So you can see that although upper management likes these types of structures, sometimes the disadvantages might outweigh the advantages, and you might want to bite a bullet and take the project organization to that next level in organizing yourself around projects. So it leads us to the conscious decision that upper management needs to make concerning how we're going to organize our management structure. And ultimately, those in charge need to answer some questions. How important is the project to the firm's success? What percentage of our core work involves projects? That will have a lot to do with it. And of course, what are our resource levels, human and physical resources? Can we actually reorganize ourselves and be more efficient? Do we've got the manpower to do that? I know that seems sort of counterintuitive, add more staffing and become more efficient. Well, that can happen in many cases, depending on how inefficient we're working now with the organizational structure that we have. Time delays, project overruns, all these things cost money, and if you can replace those costs with staffing costs and be more efficient, there might be a reason to do something with regard to staffing so that you can actually change the way you're organizing your projects. Beyond structural considerations, we got to also think about the projects themselves. How big are they? Where does it fit in our strategy? Is it a compliance project? Is it a strategic project? Is it an operational project? Where are we at with respect to innovation and novelty? How many departments are involved? Maybe even looking at the externalities. What's going on in the rest of the marketplace and the rest of the world with respect to what we're doing here? And of course, big issues on budget and time constraints. And ultimately, if you don't have the resources you need to do the work, then you got to make sure those are there and where you need them to be before you even undertake the project. Beyond management structure is organizational culture. It's the things that bind the people within the organization together, those shared norms, beliefs, and values that ultimately tie everyone together. And depending on the corporate culture, the type of organizational structure that companies organize under tends to take hold. It's the personality of the organization, and it's the way that each organization sets themselves apart. If you think of companies and their culture, think of Google, the culture at Google, or the culture at Apple, or at least the old culture at Apple. Maybe the new culture is a little different. But if you think about what that personality or culture is, it's the way individuals at the organization identify themselves as being part of a bigger thing, and ultimately the culture helps legitimize the way management organize and the way management works, and of course looking at how we behave, what's right and what's wrong. Corporate culture, brought to its extreme, we can get into situations like Enron and Andersen Consulting, and hopefully those are the things in corporate culture the worst in corporate culture that we don't want to see, versus some of the really good things that other organizations wind up doing as a result of the norms and beliefs and values that they have. One way to figure out the cultural characteristics of an organization is to study their buildings, study what they represent when you walk up to the front door. I always tell this story in my class about the company I used to work for, Underwriters Laboratories. When you walked into the front door of the main office building in their headquarters, in addition to seeing a receptionist, you saw a museum. Underwriters Laboratories, when I started working there, was a 100-year-old company, so now they're 125 years old. They've been around for a while, and they enjoy and like to show that they've been part of history, or at least the work that they've done has helped humanity, and especially since they have a public safety charge and they test products for organizations throughout the world. And having an organization that's been doing that for a long time, there's a lot of history that goes into that, and the organization is very proud of that history. It shows that there's a strong foundation, that they value the knowledge base they've obtained over the course of time with respect to public safety, product safety, standards, and other work that Underwriters Laboratories does. Another way you can tell about organizations, look at their annual reports, look at the materials they publish, both the marketing materials and the less subtle materials that they publish, whether they're news bulletins or other things that they get involved in. Look at how people interact within the organization. What type of stories are they telling when you talk to them at lunchtime? Those are the things that really drive this cultural characterization of organizations. Folks that study this organization culture stuff, sociologists and human resources specialists, look at these 10 characteristics to define an organization's culture. Things like member identity, team emphasis, where management focuses they think is important, risk tolerance levels, conflict tolerance, all the things that you might think about studying when you're trying to identify where an organization's at. And so some very smart people have taken a look at this for organizations that are very successful with projects and have found some interesting trends. So what you can see here in this slide is the band. It's kind of banded data. It's not like there's one specific data point along the spectrum. And so what you're looking at here, just so you understand it, under member identity, it looks like within that category for organizational culture, organizations that are very supportive of project management tend to have people identify more with the organization than they do with the job. They tend to emphasize the group more than the individual, tend to focus more on people than in tasks, are very interdependent on individual units, allow for a little bit of looseness in the way they control, high risk tolerance, rewarding for performance versus rewarding for other criteria, a high conflict tolerance, sort of in the middle with respect to whether they're focused on the means or the ends, and they keep an open look at what's going on with the real world, so they have an external focus. So organizations that can be identified as having these cultural characteristics tend to be very supportive and very successful in their managing of projects. So where does this leave you as a project manager within an organization? Well, you're stuck. You're stuck with the culture and the subcultures of the parent organization to some extent. Organizations that are going through significant transitions might have swinging cultural changes or a change in culture, but ultimately you need to understand the culture you're working in and figure out how to interact not within the organization, but also with the client's organization and your customer's organization and anyone else connected to the project. So individual companies are not robots. They don't act the same way. And so you have to be able to react and ebb and flow to the different cultures. So it's worth not only understanding your own culture, but the culture of your customers, the culture of your service providers, and anyone else involved with your project to make sure that you can get the most out of them and the best things you can out of them by first understanding where they're coming from. This wraps up Chapter 3, and we'll see you again when we talk about Chapter 4.